Welcome back, and thank you for tuning in to HK Cheating Stories. We appreciate each and every one of you joining us. Where in the world are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. Now, let's get the story started. My name is Linda, and if you had asked me a year ago, I would have told you I had the perfect life. A devoted husband, 2 wonderful kids, a stable home, everything a woman could ask for. But I threw it all away. It started with a single thought. Is this all there is? A whisper of doubt that grew louder until it consumed me. My friends said I deserved more, that I could have passion, excitement, freedom. So I made a choice. I asked my husband for an open marriage. And in doing so, I set fire to everything I loved. I never imagined my marriage would come to this. Sitting across from my husband, David, at our usual dining table, I felt my pulse quicken. The scent of roasted chicken filled the air, but I had no appetite. My hands trembled slightly as I gripped my wine glass. This was it. This was the moment I would change everything. I glanced at him, his strong jawline, the light wrinkles at the corners of his eyes, the same man I had loved for 18 years. He was focused on cutting his food, completely unaware of the storm about to hit him. I cleared my throat. David, are you happy? He looked up, a faint smile playing on his lips. With what? With everything. Our life. Our marriage. David wiped his mouth with a napkin, his expression thoughtful. I have a loving wife, 2 great kids, a beautiful home. We live comfortably, have good careers. What's not to be happy about? I swallowed hard, gripping my fork to keep my hands steady. I'm glad you feel that way. But I feel like something's missing. A long silence stretched between us. His gaze sharpened, his smile fading. Missing. I forced myself to continue. I love you, David. I really do. But lately, I've been feeling restless. His posture stiffened. Restless how? I took a deep breath, willing myself to sound confident. I've been talking to friends, reading about relationships. And I think we should try something new. David set his fork down, his hands tightening into fists. Linda, what are you saying? My heart pounded. I hadn't expected this to be easy, but I hadn't anticipated the sheer weight of guilt pressing down on me. I want us to have an open marriage. The air in the room shifted. The warmth of our home, the familiar safety of our shared life, suddenly felt foreign and fragile. David's face went blank for a moment, as if his brain refused to process my words. Then, his jaw tightened, his eyes darkening with something between fury and disbelief. Say that again. I hesitated. I think we should be able to see other people. Just to bring some excitement back into our lives. His hand gripped his wine glass so tightly I thought it might shatter. Excitement. His voice was dangerously low, like a warning. You want to sleep with other men. I flinched at his bluntness. It's not just about that. It's about freedom, about new experiences. He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. New experiences? Jesus, Linda, are you hearing yourself? Tears stung the corners of my eyes, but I pushed forward. This doesn't mean I love you any less, David. I need something more. His chair scraped loudly against the floor as he stood up abruptly. He ran a hand through his hair, his breaths heavy. So what am I supposed to do, huh? Sit at home while you... He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. God, I can't believe this. I reached for his arm, but he pulled away. It doesn't have to be like that. You could meet someone, too. You're still attractive, David. Younger women would love a guy like you. His eyes snapped to mine, burning with something raw and painful. That's not the damn point, Linda. My stomach clenched. Then what is the point? The point is, I made vows to you. To be faithful, to love only you. His voice cracked slightly, and it felt like a punch to my chest. Did you ever take them seriously? I bit my lip, my throat tightening. Things change, David. People change. He exhaled slowly, his whole body trembling with restrained emotion. I need to get out of here. Panic surged through me as he grabbed his jacket and headed for the back door. David, please. He turned back, his face filled with something I had never seen before. Disgust, heartbreak, and maybe even hatred. I can't even look at you right now. The door slammed behind him. I stood frozen in place, my hands shaking violently. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. My friends had assured me he would resist at first, but then he'd come around. They said men always think about what they'll gain. But David wasn't like other men. For the first time that night, doubt crept into my mind. Had I just destroyed my marriage in a single conversation? Tears slipped down my cheeks as I stared at the empty seat across from me. I had wanted freedom, but in that moment, all I felt was loss. I barely slept that night. David never came back to bed. His side remained untouched, the sheets cold and undisturbed. Every creak of the house made my heart race, but the front door never opened. At some point, exhaustion won, and I drifted into a restless sleep. When I woke up, sunlight streamed through the curtains. I turned, instinctively reaching for David, only to find emptiness. A lump formed in my throat. He had always been an early riser, but today, it felt different. Pulling on a robe, I hurried downstairs. The kids, Jake and Emma, were already at the breakfast table, chatting about their weekend plans. But David was nowhere in sight. "Where's your dad?" I asked, forcing my voice to sound normal. "He left early for work," Emma said, not looking up from her phone. "Said he'd be late," Jake added between bites of cereal. I nodded, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in my gut. David never left without saying goodbye. Never. I grabbed my phone and texted him. "I love you. Let's talk later." No reply. At work, I buried myself in meetings, trying to convince myself that everything would be fine. David just needed time. That's what my friends had told me. Men always come around. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. Lunchtime rolled around, and still no response. I hesitated before calling him. It went straight to voicemail. "Hey, it's me," I said softly, keeping my voice upbeat. "Just wanted to say I love you. We'll figure this out, okay?" I hung up and stared at my phone, willing it to vibrate. It didn't. That evening, when I pulled into the driveway, David's car wasn't there. My stomach twisted. He had never been the kind of man to drown his sorrows in a bar, but I had no idea where he was. Inside, the kids greeted me casually, oblivious to the tension suffocating the house. I forced a smile and helped them with dinner, but every second that passed without David felt heavier. Finally, just before 10 p.m., headlights swept across the living room window. The front door creaked open, and David stepped inside. I rushed toward him. "David, where have you?" He brushed past me. "I'm exhausted." His voice was empty. No anger, no warmth. Just nothing. He set his briefcase down and walked straight out to the backyard, disappearing into the darkness. I followed, stepping onto the porch, my heart pounding. "David, please, talk to me." He stood with his back to me, hands clenched at his sides. When he finally turned, his expression was unreadable. "I know you won't let this go, Linda," he said, his voice eerily calm. "So I spent the day thinking. Researching." I frowned. "Researching? Open relationships." My stomach tightened. David exhaled slowly, like he was holding something in. "I've come to a conclusion. If I say no, you'll cheat on me anyway. Either way, I lose." "That's not true," I said quickly. He let out a hollow laugh. "Isn't it?" I opened my mouth, but no words came. He nodded, as if answering his own question. "Fine. You win." Relief surged through me, but it was fleeting. "We need rules," he continued. His eyes locked onto mine, cold and unyielding. "No men in our house. Our bed stays sacred." I swallowed hard. "Of course. Protection. Always. I don't trust you to be careful." I flinched. "David. And most importantly," he said, stepping closer, "I am not responsible for your needs anymore. Not your emotional needs. Not your romantic needs. And definitely not your physical needs." A chill ran through me. "You want freedom?" His voice dropped lower, each word sharp as a knife. "Fine. But you'll find out soon enough what it costs." For the first time, doubt clawed at me. I had expected resistance, maybe anger, but not this. Not complete detachment. David had always been passionate, intense, deeply connected to me. But now, staring into his eyes, I saw nothing but emptiness. I had wanted an open marriage, and now I had it. That night, he didn't come to bed. And the next night. And the night after that. Each morning, he was up before me, gone before I could catch him. At dinner, he spoke to the kids like nothing had changed, but when it came to me, silence. Days turned into weeks. I should have been happy. I was free. I had joined a dating app and was already chatting with younger men. My coworkers gushed over my bravery, hyping me up as if I had just discovered some secret to happiness. But every night, when I climbed into an empty bed, I felt the cold truth pressing in on me. David had agreed, but in doing so, he had walked away from me, and I wasn't sure if he'd ever come back. The first night I went out, I expected something to change. I had spent hours getting ready, slipping into a dress that hugged my figure, adding a little more makeup than usual. The mirror reflected a woman I hadn't seen in years, excited, nervous, and ready for something new. David barely acknowledged me when I left. He sat in the living room, reading something on his phone, his face unreadable. I lingered in the doorway, half expecting him to stop me, to demand I stay. He didn't. Instead, he simply glanced up and said, "Be careful." I swallowed hard. "I will." He nodded, then returned to his reading, as if I were just another detail in the background. A strange knot formed in my stomach, but I ignored it, stepping outside into the crisp night air. At the bar, my friends were waiting, buzzing with excitement. Janet, who had first planted the idea of an open marriage in my mind, grinned as she slid a drink toward me. "To freedom," she toasted. "To new experiences," Marie added. I clinked my glass with theirs, forcing a smile. The music pulsed around us, laughter filled the air, and I convinced myself this was what I wanted. Then James arrived. He was younger, confident, and eager. Flirting came easy to him, and it felt good to be desired. We talked, we danced, and when he suggested we get a hotel room, I hesitated only for a second before agreeing. For a few hours, I forgot everything. The guilt, the fear, the uncertainty. But when it was over, when I lay in a bed that wasn't mine, beside a man who wasn't my husband, reality hit me like a freight train. This wasn't what I expected. I wasn't exhilarated. I wasn't liberated. I was empty. Still, I forced myself to believe it would get better, that the guilt would fade, that I just needed to adjust. By the time I got home, it was almost dawn. The house was dark, quiet. I tiptoed inside, my pulse pounding as I glanced toward David's study. The door was ajar, and I could just make out his silhouette. He was awake, sitting at his desk, the glow of his laptop illuminating his face. For a split second, I considered going to him, curling up beside him the way I used to after a night out with friends, telling him I was home, that I loved him. But that part of our marriage was gone. So instead, I slipped upstairs alone. The next morning, things were different. Not in an obvious way, David still acted the same, still spoke to the kids, still went about his usual routine. But there was a shift in the air. It was in the way he barely looked at me, in the way his touches, once casual, once so frequent, had vanished entirely. At dinner, he spoke to Emma and Jake with warmth, laughing at their stories, but when our eyes met across the table, there was nothing. He had removed himself from me, and for the first time since this started, I realized what that truly meant. As the weeks went on, I found myself clinging to the excitement of my new life, trying to silence the nagging feeling that I had lost something far more valuable. My friends cheered me on, encouraging me to embrace the attention, to enjoy my new freedom. "David will come around," Janet assured me one night at work. "He's probably already looking for his own fun." I wanted to believe that, but something about David's silence unsettled me more than if he had raged, argued, fought against it. Then, one evening, I saw it. A notification flashed on his phone while he was cooking. Just a name, nothing else, but something about the way he swiftly turned the screen away sent a spike of unease through me. I knew better than to ask. I had set the rules, after all. I had demanded my own freedom, so I had no right to question his. But that didn't stop the jealousy from creeping in. David had never been a flirt, had never been interested in anything outside our marriage. But now I wondered, had my request broken him enough to change that? That night, for the first time, I found myself staring at the empty side of the bed, wondering if he was truly alone. The kids started noticing. "Why don't you and Dad talk much anymore?" Emma asked one evening while we did the dishes. I forced a smile. "We're just busy, sweetheart." She frowned. "You used to be different." Jake, never one to stay quiet, chimed in from the kitchen table. "Yeah, and Dad doesn't even sit on the couch with you anymore." I swallowed hard, scrubbing a plate with more force than necessary. "Things change." Jake exchanged a look with Emma. "Are you and Dad gonna get divorced?" My heart stopped. "No," I said quickly. Too quickly. Jake shrugged, unconvinced. "I hope not. But it feels weird now." I turned away, gripping the edge of the sink. This was what I had asked for. And yet, I had never felt more alone. David didn't confront me about my late nights. He didn't ask about the men I was seeing. But something had changed. I had thought I was the one in control of this new chapter of our marriage. I had thought David would always be the same, always there, always tethered to me even as I drifted. But I was wrong. Because David had changed, too. And for the first time since this began, I was terrified of what that meant. David was slipping away from me. I could feel it in the way he carried himself, in the way his presence filled the house, but never touched me. He had mastered the art of indifference, and it was driving me insane. I had expected anger. I had expected arguments, maybe even resentment. But this quiet, calculated distance, it was worse. And then there was her. Susan. I had known her for years, David's best friend since childhood. She was always around, always in his corner, but I never saw her as a threat. She had her own life, her own career, and she had always respected our marriage. Until now. It started with little things. David would leave the house without telling me where he was going, but I knew. I knew because Emma mentioned it. Dad had lunch with Aunt Susan today, she said offhandedly one evening while scrolling through her phone. I nearly dropped the plate I was washing. Oh, yeah, Emma continued, not even glancing up. They went to that Italian place downtown. She even picked us up from school after. My chest tightened. She did. Jake, sitting at the kitchen table, smirked. Yeah, she's been around a lot more lately. I forced a laugh. Well, she and your dad are old friends. Yeah, Jake said, stretching. But now it's like all the time. I turned back to the sink, gripping the counter. David had replaced me. I wasn't stupid. I knew Susan had always been important to him. But now, she was filling a space that should have been mine. And I had given it to her. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the glow of my phone screen illuminating my face. I had gone on 2 dates that week, both with young, eager men who had no idea I was a married woman playing pretend. And yet, I had never felt more unwanted. David, on the other hand, was thriving. He was working out, eating better. Even his wardrobe had changed, sharper, more put together. I had spent years trying to get him to care more about his appearance, and now, suddenly, he was doing it without me. For himself. For her. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know. So the next morning, I waited. I watched. When he left the house around noon, I followed. I told myself I wasn't being crazy, that I wasn't some jealous wife stalking her husband, but the truth clawed at my gut. David drove across town and parked outside a small cafe. And there she was, Susan, sitting by the window, smiling as he walked in. The moment he saw her, his whole demeanor shifted. The indifference that had become so familiar vanished. He smiled. A real smile. The kind I hadn't seen in months. I felt sick. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel, watching them talk, laugh, share an intimacy that had once belonged to me. I should have left, but I couldn't. Not when he reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Not when she let him. My breath hitched. My marriage was over. Not officially, not yet. But emotionally, David was already gone. That night, I confronted him. He had just finished putting Jake to bed when I stepped into the hallway. Arms crossed. Voice steady despite the storm inside me. How long has it been going on? David froze, his expression unreadable. Excuse me. I took a step closer. You and Susan. His jaw clenched. There is no me and Susan. Then why are you with her all the time? I snapped. Why do you look at her like that, but not at me? His eyes darkened. Oh, you care now? I flinched. David exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. You don't get to do this, Linda. You don't get to ask for an open marriage, sleep with other men, and then get jealous when I find someone who actually respects me. My heart pounded. So you admit it. He looked me dead in the eye. I admit that Susan has been more of a partner to me these past few months than you have. Tears burned behind my eyes. David, I never wanted to lose you. He shook his head, disappointment flickering across his face. You didn't lose me, Linda. You let me go. I cried myself to sleep that night. And the next, I went on more dates, tried to drown the ache in attention and meaningless affection, but it didn't help. Because every night, I came home to a house that no longer felt like mine, to a husband who no longer belonged to me. And the worst part? I had no one to blame but myself. It happened so suddenly, I didn't even see it coming. One evening, after months of avoiding dinner at home, I decided to be present, to sit at the table with my family, to act as though I was still a part of something I had spent years building. I had convinced myself that things weren't as bad as they seemed, that David was just bitter, that the kids didn't notice, that I could still reclaim my place in this house. But I was wrong. So wrong. I walked into the dining room, forcing a smile. Hey guys. David was setting plates on the table, dressed in one of his newer button-down shirts. Emma and Jake were already seated, scrolling through their phones. But it wasn't David's clothes that caught my attention. It was the extra plate on the table. And then, she walked in. Susan. She carried a bowl of roasted potatoes, setting them down as naturally as if she had lived here her entire life. I stopped dead in my tracks. She was here, in my house, serving food to my family. And no one looked surprised. I swallowed hard. What is she doing here? David didn't look up. She's having dinner with us. The casual way he said it, like it was nothing, like it was normal, made my stomach twist. I looked at my kids. And you're okay with this? Emma barely glanced at me. Why wouldn't we be? Jake smirked. She's been around more than you have, Mom. The words hit me like a slap. I turned to David. You let her replace me? For the first time that night, David met my gaze, his expression unreadable. You left first. Tears burned behind my eyes. I never left. His jaw clenched. Yes, you did, Linda. Maybe not physically, but emotionally. You checked out the moment you asked for an open marriage. My heart pounded. So what is this? I gestured towards Susan. You and her? Are you together? He didn't answer, but he didn't deny it, either. Emma scoffed, pushing her chair back. God, Mom, you don't get to act like the victim. I turned to her, shocked. Excuse me. Emma's eyes burned with resentment. You left us. You were never here. You were too busy living your best life, right? Jake muttered. Yeah, but Dad was still here. I stared at my children, the ones I had given birth to, the ones I had loved more than anything, and realized I had lost them. They weren't mine anymore. They were his, and they had already chosen their side. Dinner was a nightmare. I sat there, silent, watching Susan laugh with my kids, watching David engage in easy conversation with her. I had always assumed I could come back anytime, that no matter how far I strayed, I would always have a place at this table. But I was wrong. I didn't belong here anymore. I was a guest in my own home. By the time dinner was over, I couldn't breathe. I hurried upstairs, needing space, needing to think, but when I stepped into our bedroom, it didn't feel like mine anymore. David's things were gone. The closet, once filled with his clothes, was half empty. The nightstand where he used to leave his watch, his wallet, his book, empty. Panic surged through me. I ran to the other side of the house, past Jake's room, past Emma's, until I reached a door I had never noticed before. I hesitated for only a second before pushing it open. And there it was. A new living space. A bedroom. A small sitting area. A desk. David had built himself an entirely separate life under my nose. I staggered back, my breath coming in short gasps. This was it. This was the moment I realized I had truly lost him. And the worst part? He had stopped caring enough to even tell me. When I finally worked up the courage to go back downstairs, I found David on the deck, staring out at the yard. I stepped outside, my voice shaking. When did you do it? He didn't turn around. A few months ago. I swallowed hard. And you didn't think to tell me? A bitter laugh escaped him. Tell you? Why, Linda? You were barely here. I clenched my fists. So what now? You just live separately from me? That's it. Finally, he turned. His eyes were unreadable, but there was something there, pity. And God, I hated it. Linda, he said slowly, we have been living separately for a long time. You just didn't notice. Tears welled in my eyes. I don't want to lose you. His expression didn't change. You already have. I shook my head, stepping closer. I was stupid, David. I thought this would be good for us. I thought we could make it work. But I don't want this anymore. I don't want anyone else. I just want you. For a second, I thought I saw something flash in his eyes. Hesitation, maybe even sorrow. But it disappeared just as quickly. You wanted freedom, he murmured. You got it. I reached for him, but he took a step back. I knew, in that moment, that no matter what I said, no matter how much I begged, I couldn't fix this. David was gone. Not physically, not yet. But emotionally, he had already left me behind. I had fought so hard for my own happiness. And in the process, I had destroyed the one thing that had ever truly made me happy. That night, for the first time in our entire marriage, David didn't come home at all. And I knew, deep in my bones, that nothing would ever be the same again. The day David handed me the divorce papers, I felt like I had been punched in the gut. It wasn't a fight. It wasn't a screaming match. It wasn't anything like I had imagined. It was worse. Because he was calm. Because he had already moved on. I had spent the past few weeks desperately trying to fix things. I stayed home more. I forced myself to be present, to act like the wife I should have been. I texted him, asking how his day was. I tried making his favorite meals. I even stopped seeing other men altogether, deleting my dating apps, cutting off contact with the ones who had once made me feel desirable. But it didn't matter. David had already checked out. His mind was made up. And Susan? She was still there. Always there. Filling the space I had abandoned. It was obvious now that she had been waiting. Maybe not intentionally, maybe not maliciously, but she had always been there. Just a step behind, just close enough to catch him when I let go. And I had let go. I just never expected him to not want me back. The kids knew before I did. Emma was the first to notice. "You should stop trying, Mom," she told me one afternoon, barely looking up from her book. "It's over." My heart squeezed painfully. "What are you talking about?" She sighed, flipping a page. "Dad is done. He's moving on. He's with Susan now." I felt like the room had tilted. "That's not. He hasn't said." Emma rolled her eyes. "He doesn't have to say it. It's obvious." Jake, sitting at the kitchen counter, finally looked up. "Yeah, Mom. He's happier now." I sucked in a sharp breath. "You don't know that." But Jake only shrugged. "Yeah, I do. He actually smiles now. He jokes with us again. It's like he's himself. His real self. The self I had taken away from him." I swallowed the lump in my throat, forcing my voice to stay steady. "He and I just need time. I know I made mistakes, but marriages go through rough patches." Emma scoffed. "This isn't a rough patch, Mom. This is the end." I didn't believe it, not really. Not until that night. David came home late, as he often did now. I was waiting in the kitchen, my hands gripping the counter. As soon as he walked in, I blurted it out. "Are you with Susan?" He didn't flinch, didn't hesitate, but he didn't answer, either. That silence told me everything. I clenched my jaw. "David." He exhaled slowly, setting his keys down. "It's not like that, Linda." I laughed bitterly. "Really?" "Because it sure looks like that." He finally met my gaze. "Susan has been there for me. She's helped me through this." "This?" My voice cracked. "You mean our marriage falling apart?" His expression softened, and for a moment, I thought maybe, I could still reach him. I stepped closer. "David, please. We can fix this. We can go to therapy. We can." "No," he said firmly. I froze. His eyes were full of something I had never seen before, finality. "There's nothing left to fix, Linda." My throat tightened. "You don't mean that." But he did. I could see it. The love, the devotion, the unwavering loyalty he had given me for nearly 20 years, it was gone. And in its place was only a man who had finally let me go. That's when he pulled the papers from his bag and placed them on the counter. My stomach dropped. I looked down, my vision blurring. Divorce. The one thing I never thought he would actually go through with. The one thing I had always assumed would be off the table. And yet, there it was, staring back at me in bold, unforgiving letters. I shook my head. "No." His voice was quiet but firm. "Yes." Tears burned behind my eyes. "David, I'm done, Linda." I let out a shaky breath, gripping the edge of the counter. "I still love you." His gaze softened, but it wasn't love in his eyes. It was pity. And God, I hated it. He exhaled, rubbing his temples. "We have 2 amazing kids. We built a life together, and I will always respect that. But I don't love you anymore." The words sliced through me like a blade. I shook my head, refusing to believe it. "Sign the papers," he said gently. "Let's end this the right way." I looked up at him, tears spilling onto my cheeks. This was it, the final nail in the coffin of our marriage. And for the first time, I had to face the truth. I had asked for an open marriage, and now I had lost my own. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the divorce papers sitting untouched on my nightstand. David was asleep in his new room. The kids were in theirs. And I was alone. For real this time. Not just emotionally. Not just metaphorically. Completely. And I had done it to myself. The day I signed the divorce papers, it felt like I was signing away my entire life. I held the pen in my trembling hand, staring at the lines, at my name printed so neatly beside David's. My throat was tight, my chest felt hollow, and yet, deep down, I knew. I had no right to be surprised. David had already moved on. I was just the last one refusing to accept it. When it was done, when my signature was inked beside his, I sat at the kitchen table long after David had left the room. The house was too quiet. The kids weren't home. Emma was off at college, and Jake had gone to a friend's house for the weekend. I had never felt so alone. And worse, for the first time, I couldn't blame anyone but myself. For months, I had told myself that this wasn't my fault, that I had been misled by my friends, that I had only wanted to bring excitement into my life, to chase something that had started to slip away. But I had been selfish. And now, sitting in this empty house, with nothing but my regrets to keep me company, I finally understood what I had lost. David wasn't just my husband. He was my home, and I had burned it down with my own 2 hands. I tried dating again. I tried convincing myself that I could move on, just like David had. Tom, the man I had been seeing during my new chapter, was still around, still eager, still willing to give me the attention I had once craved. But he wasn't David, and he never would be. Still, I clung to him. I told myself that love could be rebuilt, that I could find a way to fill the aching void in my heart with something, anything. But I was wrong, because the truth was, Tom was never going to be a real partner. He was still married, still tangled in a life that wasn't mine to claim. And the worst part? He never planned on leaving his wife. One night, after weeks of feeling the distance grow between us, I finally confronted him. We were at his apartment, a place he had promised was just for him. Though I knew it was merely a hiding spot from the life he wasn't brave enough to leave behind. I stood in the doorway, my arms crossed, my voice steadier than I felt. "Tell me the truth, Tom. Do you actually see a future with me?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Linda, why are you doing this?" I swallowed. "Because I need to know." His silence was my answer. I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. I was a fool. "Linda, don't." "No," I cut him off. "I left my marriage for this. For you. And you were never going to leave her, were you?" He hesitated. "It's complicated." I scoffed. "No, Tom, it's really not." I grabbed my purse and walked to the door. And for the first time in months, I didn't look back. That Christmas, I sat alone in the house I had once shared with David. The decorations were sparse. I hadn't bothered with the tree, hadn't hung the stockings. It didn't feel right. I knew the kids were with him, with her. And for the first time, it really sank in. I had been replaced, not just as David's wife, but as a mother. The kids had chosen him. And deep down, I couldn't blame them. Because when they needed me most, I had been too busy chasing a fantasy to notice I was losing my family. A sharp knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts. I hesitated before opening it, my breath catching when I saw who it was. David. He stood there, looking the same as always, yet completely different. Happier. Lighter. And in his arms, he held a small gift. "For Jake," he said, holding it out. "He left it here last time he visited." I swallowed hard, nodding. "Thank you." David hesitated, glancing past me into the empty house. "Are you spending Christmas alone?" I forced a smile. "I'm fine." He studied me for a long moment, then sighed. "Linda, we're having dinner at my place. The kids will be there. You can come." I blinked in surprise. "You want me there?" His expression softened. "The kids do." My heart clenched. This wasn't a reconciliation. This wasn't an invitation back into his life. It was pity. It was mercy. And it was the only thing I had left. I hesitated, then nodded. "Okay." That night, I sat at David's dinner table for the first time since our divorce. Susan was there, of course. She moved around the kitchen effortlessly, laughing with Emma, joking with Jake. And David? He looked content. I watched as he smiled, as he pulled Susan close, as she whispered something in his ear that made him chuckle. And for the first time, I truly understood. He wasn't mine anymore. He hadn't been for a long time. And no matter how much I wished I could turn back time, I couldn't. I had spent so much time chasing something new, something exciting, never realizing that the most valuable thing I had was the life I had already built. And I had thrown it away. Now, all I could do was sit at this table, surrounded by the people I had lost, and pretend that I still belonged. But the truth was, I didn't. And I never would again. I always thought regret was something you could move past. That with time, the pain would dull, that life would shift into something new, something bearable. I was wrong. Regret doesn't fade. It doesn't disappear. It lingers, whispering in the quiet moments, reminding you of everything you lost, everything you destroyed. And I had destroyed everything. Months had passed since that Christmas dinner at David's house. Since I sat at the table, watching my family move on without me. I had tried to rebuild, tried dating again, tried forcing a connection with men who would never be David. But nothing worked. The truth was, I had spent so much time chasing excitement. I had never considered what it would feel like to be the one left behind. And now? Now I had nothing. Emma was away at college. Jake still spoke to me, but I could tell. He was closer to his father now. To Susan. The house was empty, and I was drowning in the silence. One night, I found myself driving with no destination in mind. I had done this often in the past few months, just driving, as if I could outrun the weight pressing down on my chest. But tonight was different. Tonight, I found myself parked outside a house I knew too well. David's house. The lights were on inside. Through the window, I could see them, David and Susan, sitting on the couch, their daughter curled up between them. A new family. A life that used to be mine. I gripped the steering wheel, my breath shaky. I should have left. But I didn't. I sat there, watching. Watching the way David looked at her the way he used to look at me. Watching the way their child, snuggled against his chest, the way Emma used to. Watching the way Susan fit into a role that had once been mine. The realization hit me with full force. There was no coming back from this. David wasn't just moving on. He already had. And I had been erased. I didn't know where else to go, so I ended up at a bar. A familiar place, a familiar routine. A drink in my hand. A stranger sitting next to me, offering polite conversation. But as I sat there, staring at my reflection in the glass, a sickening thought crept in. This is what my life has become. Empty bars. Meaningless conversations. A constant search for something that no longer exists. I had traded stability for fleeting moments of passion. I had traded love for lust. And in the end, I had been left with nothing. I don't remember how I got home that night. But I do remember waking up to a text from Jake. "Dad's worried about you." I stared at the message for a long time, my heart twisting. Not I'm worried. Not Emma's worried. Dad's worried. Even now, after everything, David still had it in him to care. And I hated that. Because I didn't deserve it. A week later, I made my decision. I couldn't keep living in the past. The house, the one David and I had built together, the one filled with memories I could never escape, it had to go. I packed up what little I had left. I put it on the market. And I left. Not to chase something new. Not to find another man. But because I had finally accepted the truth. David was gone. My family was gone. And I had to figure out who I was without them. Before I left town, I went to see him one last time. Not to beg. Not to fight. Just to say goodbye. When he opened the door, he looked surprised. I forced a small smile. Hey. He hesitated. "Everything okay?" I nodded. "I just wanted to tell you. I'm selling the house. I'm leaving." He studied me for a moment, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Regret? Pity? Maybe both. "Where will you go?" I exhaled slowly. "I don't know." And for the first time, I wasn't scared of that. David nodded, his expression unreadable. There was a time when I could have deciphered every thought in his head. But now he was a stranger, a memory of the life I had thrown away. I took a shaky breath. "I'm happy for you, you know." His lips parted slightly, like my words had caught him off guard. "I mean it," I whispered. "You deserve this." He hesitated. "You did too." The weight of his words crushed me. Because I had. I had deserved the life I had. But I had given it up. And no one had taken it from me but myself. I stepped back, offering one last, sad smile. "Goodbye, David." His throat bobbed, and for a second, I thought he might say something. But he didn't. He just nodded. And with that, I turned and walked away. This time for good. Regret never leaves you. It lingers, follows you, haunts the quiet moments. But I had spent too long drowning in it. It was time to start over. Not for a man, not for a new love, but for me. Because at the end of the day, I had lost everything. And now, I had nothing left to lose. Looking back, I see everything so clearly now. I thought I was chasing happiness, that I was searching for something missing in my life. But the truth? I already had everything I could have ever wanted. I was just too blind to see it. I learned the hard way that excitement is fleeting, but love, trust, and family, those are the things that truly last. I destroyed my marriage, not because David was a bad husband, but because I let temporary boredom convince me that something was wrong. I took stability for granted, believing there was always something better waiting just beyond my reach. There wasn't. If I could go back, I would tell myself to nurture what I had instead of looking elsewhere for fulfillment. Love isn't about constant thrill. It's about commitment. about choosing your partner even on the dull days, even when life feels ordinary. To those reading this, especially those who have shared decades with a spouse, cherish what you have. Passion fades, but companionship, trust, and shared history, those are the things that truly make a life worth living. Don't let a moment of restlessness cost you everything. Some mistakes, once made, can never be undone.